Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Alexandra Bell, and I'm the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Today, we're excited to be discussing A House of Dynamite, the new Netflix film with director Kathryn Bigelow and writer Noah Oppenheim. Bigelow is the director of Zero Dark 30 and The Hurt Locker, two films noted for their realism in portraying military operations. A House of Dynamite takes a similar approach, this time focused on an unattributed intercontinental ballistic missile heading towards the United States. This is a Hollywood film that makes choices for drama, but it's also intentionally prompting some very serious conversation about our defense strategy. So today we won't spend time nitpicking every decision the filmmakers made, but rather talking about how it serves to create a real discussion about these real issues. So why are we talking about this today? The Bulletin, for 80 years now, has focused on the greatest existential risks facing our world. While these risks include many areas such as climate change, disruptive technology, and biosecurity, nuclear weapons remain at the core of the focus of our institution. This movie provides a great opportunity to have a wide-ranging conversation about those core themes we think about every day. So we've been working with Netflix and grateful to have brought these concepts to life in a variety of ways and pre-screenings and showing. And today, so glad to have this expert panel to really dig down now that people have had a chance to watch the movie. So I'll introduce our guests and then we'll get started. First, we're thrilled to have Jill Ruby. Jill is a member of our Science and Security Board here at the Bulletin. That's the board that sets the doomsday clock. We'll actually be doing that next week. She previously served as the Undersecretary for Nuclear Security at the Department of Energy and as administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration. Prior to this, Ruby had a 34-year career at Sandia National Laboratories, including as its head. Next, we have Major General Robert H. Latiff from U.S. Air Force. Bob is also a member of our Science and Security Board. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Notre Dame. He retired from the Air Force as a Major General in 2006. During his time, Bob had firsthand experience, with nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy. Following his active duty career, he has written multiple books about the future of peace and security. Finally, we have Alex Wellerstein. Alex is an associate professor and director of Science and Technology Studies at the Stevens Institute of Technology. He's currently a visiting research with the Nuclear Knowledges Group at Sciences Po. He is the author of Restricted Data, a nuclear history blog, and the creator of Nuke Map and the Missile Map. His second book, The Most Awful Responsibility, Truman and the Secret Struggle for the Control of the Atomic Age, will be published in December 2025. I thank you all for being here. For those watching, we want to hear your questions. We're going to encourage you help drive the conversation today. But to get started, I'll be asking the questions. So get yours prepared. And just so everybody is totally solid, we will be spoiling the movie. So if you have not watched it yet, you have been warned. It looks like we've got a little bit of a technical problem, and we will be getting Jill back on as quickly as possible. So why don't we just go ahead and start with reactions from Bob and Alex. I'm curious how each of your individual experiences colored your viewing of the film. How do you think you saw it differently than from a general audience watching maybe a lot of these themes for the first time? So Bob, why don't you get us started?
Okay, thank you, Alex. Well, first of all, I'd just like a general comment and say that I too appreciated Netflix doing this because the discussion of nuclear weapons just has to be had. And so, good or bad, but minor problems aside, it was a good effort. Um, as you mentioned, I had direct up close personal experience with nuclear weapons early in my career. And later, I commanded the Cheyenne Mountain NORAD complex uh, and was part of many of the same types of discussions and training exercises. Um, I thought they did a relatively credible job of what those conversations were like. Um, perhaps they were not quite as accurate as what actually happens in real life. And so um, as a matter of, I think it was a good effort, but I want to make sure that the public sort of leaves with the idea that these people who are doing this really know what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna dig in on that a little bit later. So we'll put a pin in that. Alex, what were your initial thoughts?
Well, I'm a historian, so I haven't gotten to use nuclear weapons or be too close to them, thank goodness. But my way of thinking about the movie is sort of twofold. One is as somebody who has tried to study how various presidents have reacted to the existence of nuclear weapons or the possibilities of their use and what they do when they're confronted with war plans and things. And I think that it did a very good job of showing some of the disconnect between the sort of presidential type and, let's say, not that the representation of the Stratcom general is entirely accurate, but the people who are more in that world, who are more used to these kinds of ideas, and the absolute sort of horror of someone who is not in that world suddenly being dragged into it, which is not so off from accounts we have of people like Kennedy, even later presidents getting their briefings about nuclear weapons uses and things like that. The other thing I'm very interested in is the culture of nuclear films, the kinds of plots they have historically had. I've watched many of them over time. And so it was interesting for me to think about where does this fit in the sort of not extremely deep field of movies that are supposed to be about nuclear war and nuclear risks. And so from that perspective, it was interesting to me, and we could talk about this more later, like what choices they made narratively, um, things that differentiate it from movies like The Day After or Doctor Strangelove or Failsafe or these other sort of more classic nuclear films. But I did enjoy it as a movie, watching it again. Like the general said, there are places where you could critique it, but I did think it was a pretty gripping film.
No, no, and I think that's relatable as a former employee of the State Department. I kept asking, where is the Secretary of State? But Jill, what was your initial impression of the film and as, you know, a longtime expert on these issues, how did you think your viewing altered from somebody who's coming to these issues brand new?
Well, I think my viewing was probably quite different. I am not a fan of thriller movies. Like, I just feel like I have enough thrill in real life. Like, I don't really like these on the edge of your seat movies very much at all. So they're not the genre I watch. But this particular movie, I did not feel that way because I was problem solving or critiquing as we went. So I watched it with my husband, who said, "Oh my God, that was the most tense movie I've seen in a long time." And I did, and I was like, "Oh, I didn't even sort of recognize that because it was so in my lane in terms of trying to work through like." In my head and going along with do this now and do that. So I thought, I know some people have watched this movie many times. I haven't watched it a whole bunch of times, but my first viewing was like I was just totally absorbed in problem solving.
Yeah. Well, so on that point, how realistic was the main plot point? How easy would it be for an ICBM to slip through our early warning systems? I'll take Jill. We'll start with you, and then
Yeah, well, that part was a little contrived from my perspective. I mean, our early warning systems are really good, and it didn't matter very much to the plot of the movie, so I don't let it bother me a lot. I mean, it changed the time frame perhaps a little bit, and maybe attribution a little bit, but in the end that wasn't kind of what the movie was about, but it was good. I mean, from my perspective, it was sort of contrived. We have very good early warning systems. They're very robust. And so I think the likelihood of that particular thing happening is not that high.
mm. And Bob, you already touched on this a little bit, but in terms of how the characters were making decisions, how did that mirror what your experience was in real life? Admittedly, we have not had a scenario like this, thankfully. But your assessment as a former member of the military on how the military was acting in this film.
Well, thank you. No, fortunately, we never had an experience like this. However, I have to tell you, we trained for it endlessly, endlessly. Anybody who's involved in nuclear weapons and release decisions trains constantly. My experience is that it is a lot more not scripted, but there are very, very specific procedures that they go through, even under a lot of stress. The military people involved that I've been involved with are they follow the procedures to the letter, and so it's not a lot of make it up as you go along, which kind of came across in the movie.
Yeah. So Alex, one of the other plot points, again, spoiler, was that the attack was targeted on Chicago. And early on in the film, they had a FEMA character estimate that a strike on Chicago would estimate, 9 million casualties with 10% more downwind. You obviously are the creator of the immensely successful nuke map. If people haven't gone to that particular website yet, I recommend it. You can spend a lot of time on there. But can you talk a little bit about how your estimates would show a Chicago strike would play out? And then maybe talk a little bit about why the filmmakers may have chosen Chicago as a potential target.
So my understanding is that the Chicago metro area has about 9 million people in it. And in the graphics in the film, they seem to just indicate 9 million, and that's a population, which is fair. And then they make this jump between 9 million people living there to 9 million casualties. And that's not really how it works. And the one feels like you're minimizing, and you say like, oh, it'd only be a few 100,000. Like that's a lot better. The casualties will depend on how powerful is the weapon, where does it go off, what altitude does it go off at, where are people. If it's goes off on the ground, you have fallout effects. If it goes out in the air, you're not going to have as much of that as an acute problem. How explosive is this weapon going to be? The lack of attribution makes it really hard to know what we're supposed to expect. Is this going to be a Russian missile, a Chinese missile, a North Korean missile? These all have different warhead strengths. You're not going to kill 100% of the people or make 100% of them casualties, no matter what weapon you're using. Again, doesn't matter. It would be a lot. It would be a lot of dead people. It would be a catastrophe. It doesn't need to be 9 million. 500,000 is a catastrophe. Even 100,000 is a catastrophe in a single attack. And so I don't know what, to me, if I was going to critique it on this point, they act as if throughout the movie that everybody in Chicago is just dead. Just they're dead and they don't know it yet, right? When the reality is it would be more complicated than that. And they make, they sort of turn down the idea that, oh, you should tell people to take cover or something like that. They say, oh, what is that going to do? Well, for some people, nothing, but for some people, it might be actually productive depending on where you are relative to where it goes off. It's not the worst mitigation strategy. It certainly is easier and better than, I don't know, telling them nothing. That was a part of the movie that I was a little frustrated by. But again, I get the point. The point is to emphasize this is unimaginable. This is horrible. This is not. If you do too much emphasis on that sort of thing, it makes people think it's survivable, and it's going to be a horrible political consequence, horrible human consequence, no matter what happens. It doesn't even have to be that large of a bomb, and we would still consider it, if it's only tens of thousands of people dying, that's still like unacceptably, that's still, that doesn't change the scenario very much.
Mm-hmm. And Alex, I know you've done actually a lot of work in looking at the history of civil defense and the steps that the U.S. was taking to prepare for potential nuclear strikes, which is something that people just don't even talk about, don't do anymore. If you see a fallout shelter sign on a school, I bet kids today would be like, what is that? So maybe the conversation about civil defense is an outcropping of this movie. But another part of the movie that was particularly featured, which I think would be new to a lot of people, is the treatment of missile defense. And in this case, how missile defense failed to stop in the movie. They postulate that our current missile defense systems have a 61% rate of success, which leads to the Secretary of Defense, sort of exclaiming that's what $50 billion buys us, a coin toss. I would probably estimate it's more than $50 billion at this point. But Bob, was the deployment scenario here of the ground-based interceptors accurate, especially when the team asked themselves, did they do everything right? Was that a reasonable question to be asking?
I think it is. Was the deployment accurate or correct? Hard for me to say. When you have an inbound ICBM and some 30 odd missiles in holes, firing two, limiting it to two, seemed to be a little strange. But again, probably contrived so that there was going to be a miss. Firing two and you get 50% accuracy, you miss one, you're toast. I think probably there would have been more deployed.
That's actually a question we just got in the chat, which was, why was there no other attempt to launch more? Can you talk a little bit about the mechanics of upon the first one not separating, the kill vehicle not separating, and then the second one failing? Why didn't we launch more?
Oh, the kinematics, the mechanics of the whole thing is, it's a tail chase. So as it reaches its apogee and begins to come down, trying to catch it from where they're stationed in Alaska would have been impossible. You have a limited time period in order to launch for it to actually do the intercept. So once they missed it, firing any more at it would have been useless.
Okay, so you're trying to catch it effectively at the top before it starts coming down.
Right.
Excellent. So Jill, what's your thought on the idea of hitting a bullet with a bullet? And, is that a concept that more Americans should be talking about, thinking about as we think about nuclear threats and how missile defense can, potentially protect us?
Yeah, this is an interesting part of the movie from my perspective, because there is the issue of like, would we have used more interceptors? And I think the answer is we would have used everything we could. And there wasn't a lot of debate about that. It was sort of accepted pretty quickly that that was our final shot. In reality, defense is really hard. And also in reality, there's a lot of ways to spoof it. And this was the simplest possible way. Like one missile, one warhead, no decoys, and all of that is very simplistic. Like, we know that decoys are possible. We know that it confuses missile defense. There's a lot of missiles with more than one warhead. So this was a simple scenario. There was a message to it that was clear. But one of the things that I think it's important to think about is if we as a US had more missile defense, it wouldn't necessarily solve the real world problem. So I think we have to be careful that the take-home message from this isn't we need more missile defense to shoot down ICBMs or it's ballistic missiles, because it's going to always be hard, and it's actually much harder than was depicted in the movie.
Now, Alex, you've been, tracking this for a long time. The U.S. has long been interested in building a missile defense system that could undermine the concept of mutually assured destruction. Can you talk a little bit about that history and why it's an idea that hasn't gone away?
Since 1945, people have wanted to have a way to sort of stop the bomb militarily, a defense. And since 1945, scientists have said that's probably not going to be very viable. Even if you did get missile defenses in place that could, say, shoot down ballistic missiles, or you had something that could shoot down bombers, and we pursued all sorts of different plans, anti-bomber radar nets, and anti-air missiles that had nuclear weapons on the end of them, and all sorts of things. The problem is that there are solutions for your adversaries, and the world in which they pursue those solutions may not be the one you want to live in. So, oh, you have a limited ability to shoot down warheads? Great. They'll just make more warheads. Okay, now you're trying to make more defenses. Great. Well, they'll just keep making more offenses. Now you have a world where there's more and more weapons. Oh, you feel secure that you're not going to be attacked by ballistic missiles. Great. They'll attack you with things other than ballistic missiles, right? There are other options out there. And a lot of the developments we've seen the Russians doing lately and the Chinese have been essentially like somewhat dubious ways to try and say we are not constrained by ballistic missile defenses, which, let's just be clear, is exactly what the United States would do if we thought that the Russians had a working missile defense or the Chinese had a working missile defense. We wouldn't just say, well, you got us, right? We would technologically go around that in some ways. So the argument against missile defense is both that it's so difficult technically and so expensive that, like, why are you there are other things you could spend your money on and get security. And then ultimately, what do you get from doing that? You get enemies who expand the size of their arsenal by a factor of 3, like we see the Chinese doing. uh, you don't get the political situation that you want out of that because our enemies are not simplistic, and there are, as Jill was saying, there's ways to spoof it. There's in a plausible situation, you think they're just going to sit there and wait before attacking the missile defenses themselves, right? There's like a lot of vulnerabilities throughout the system. So to me, the trickiest part about the movie, frankly, is that it's very easy to take away a message, which I know is not the intention of the director or the writer, that, like, oh, if only we just had more missile defenses, this whole scenario would have been fixed. I think that's a really tricky aspect of it because that's not what anybody, I think, involved wants the message to be. It's certainly not what any experts who are not being paid to make missile defense think is the right solution here. But because it's this like one-off attack with no countermeasures, you could imagine a different, even contrived scenario that defeats missile defense in some other way and shows, like, well, it's really just not adequate for what you're trying to do. It's a waste of money, and it doesn't get you the security you think it does. But that would be a different plot.
Yeah. So in addition to missile defense, which is something I think the public hasn't thought as much about, there was also the issue of sole authority here. That it is the president and the president alone that makes the decision about whether or not to employ nuclear forces. So Jill, let's start with you. The movie implied that the president had choices between, a diner menu that had rare, medium, and well done. Is that an accurate portrayal of the choices in front of the president? And how do these scenarios even get formed to be in a book in front of the president in the first place?
Yeah, well, it is true that scenarios get formed to be in front of the president. So that part is relatively accurate, whether they would be described in this particular way, but it's a movie. So, but there will always be non-nuclear options presented to the president, not just nuclear options in response to, a potential nuclear strike. I think also there's a lot of the Stratcom commander in the movie portrayal was not as disciplined as I would expect the Stratcom commander to be in real life. Like, be able to describe the scenarios quite clearly, not just rely on the mill aid that was in the plane at the time, but, be able to fill in the details, answer questions, provide much more context than what was provided in the movie. But I mean, this whole thing brings up the issue of the cliffhanger of should you wait to do something or do you need to make a decision now? And that is one of the things that I think is important for, the public to understand, that in a scenario like this, you wouldn't be pushed, your back wouldn't be against the wall in the same way as if there were a lot of missiles coming at your missile fields where you had to make a quick choice. And so one of the interesting things about this movie, there's a lot of hand-wringing about, do I need to do anything now? And how would the public be, I can't speak to the sort of public perception part, but I think that there would be there wouldn't feel quite as much pressure as the movie sort of portrayed as to doing something before it even went off or landed, or however you want to, whatever word you want to use there. And you could still do something quickly, but I think that the scenario where you have to make quick decisions is really about a scenario where we feel like our second strike capability is being wiped out or our missile fields are being wiped out, and that wasn't what was portrayed here. So I think this is I just would say that I also just think it was a little unfair to the discipline of the military, the way this was portrayed. Nonetheless, there are scenarios, that part's all real. There is a guy with a suitcase, a person with a suitcase, that part's all real. So it's a little bit of a dramatization that perhaps was I think a little unrealistic, but the overall arc of the thing was okay.
So Bob, do you have thoughts on that same, the sort of push in the timing, to get the president to make a decision, is that, time crunch really a factor, or as Jill said, is it totally scenario dependent? And then because we pay the big bucks, a difficult question here. If a person in the sort of chain of command thinks that a launch order is not legal, what is their recourse, if the president were to potentially order such a strike?
Well, that is a really tough question, and I think the answer to that is very personal. So if I were the commander, Stratcom, and I thought it was the wrong decision, I really had two choices. I only really have one choice, and that's to disobey the order and retire. I mean, he'll find somebody else to do whatever it is he wants them to do. I think Jill described the answer to your first question, very accurately. The only thing I might add is that to the disciplinary thing, there are missile event conferences in which very well-trained people discuss potential options for the president based upon what it is he thought he might like to do. And no, there are no rare, medium, and well done. The president is presented with packages based upon, do you want to do this? Do you want to send a message? Do you want to destroy the place? And then he chooses from those packages. But given an order that you think is illegal in any circumstance, whether it's nuclear or not, you really only have a choice, disobey it and retire.
Now, Alex, the president seems to not have any idea of how to respond to this issue, and sort of remarks that he got one briefing and really nothing after the fact. Is that accurate? Are the presidents that we have really that unprepared post Cold War?
Yeah, my understanding is it depends on the president. There have been some who have essentially indicated that they had very little briefings, and there are, of course, some who are quite deep into that stuff historically and quite interested. It's in this fictional universe in which Idris Elba is the president and hasn't been the president, I believe, for that long. The movie takes place in July, and I think he's only supposed to have been there. Well, it's not implausible that they would not have had a deep briefing on the things that are considered to be really unlikely. And they discuss that in the movie. I mean, he makes a joke about how he has gotten a million briefings on what to do if a Supreme Court justice dies or something like that. That's much more likely than this bolt out of the blue nuclear attack. So is it possible? Sure, it's totally possible. There have been presidents, and my next book is all about Truman in particular, who were dramatically out of the loop at times. Now, that's not a modern present thing, but it's they're human and they're busy, and if they don't want to have a briefing, there's no way to force them to. If a president doesn't want to learn something, they don't have to learn it, right? It's not that kind of dynamic where they have to go to class or something. I would just say, I just want to piggyback a little on some of this discussion about the military. They are so, in this film, so interested in railroading the president that my alternative conspiracy theory is that the United States launched the missile and the military are using it as a pretext, right? That would almost make more sense than anything else, any other plot, because who else is going to be able to turn off the early warning detection? Who else is going to be making sure they know who the one person the president's going to be talking to about nuclear war plans is, and only presenting these massive nuclear options? That's, I don't think, the actual plot of the movie, but that would make in some ways more sense than the one they had if it turned out it was actually a Dr. Strangelove rogue situation.
Well, we've got a good question sort of in line with that. How likely is it that there would be a missile coming at us that we didn't know who sent it? Bob, we'll start with you.
Highly unlikely. As Jill mentioned earlier, I think the warning systems, the early warning systems we have are really quite good, quite accurate, and quite sensitive. So it's a very low probability that we would have one that we didn't expect.
Yeah, and Jill, what would we do if that were the case, even as improbable as it is and portrayed in the film? Like, do you think the reaction that you saw in the film, because you were problem solving while you were watching it, is what we would do in the event of a missile from an unknown source?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to go back because I realized after I answered the question the first time, the movie said there was some likely cyber attack on early warning systems that led to this. We couldn't tell, like we didn't see it. And, people worry about cyber and AI attacks a lot, and they should. Like, we should worry about that. That's the only way you're going to actually prevent them. But again, these are pretty robust systems compared to just your ordinary satellite system or detection system. So I think that they wanted an unattributed attack, which makes sense, but the chance of that's not that high. These are super robust systems. Now, having said that, like, the whole question about what would we do this is part of the movie that like bothered me quite a bit. Like, the idea that we couldn't reach other leaders, and that the deputy national security advisor was the person trying to reach out, and the deputy national security advisor and the president really didn't know each other. This was all pretty not plausible to me. Like, this was like so it's really a shame that our diplomacy is not so good right now with everybody that could, all of our adversaries, right? With Russia and China and North Korea and others who, that this could happen. But nonetheless, the everybody would be trying, like, to reach, and everybody has some contacts, right? And so at a high level, And then the question really becomes, you know, and this was somewhat portrayed in the movie, can we trust this or can we trust that? But you know, there would be so many people working so many angles trying to decide, like, you know, where this came from and what does everybody else know. And nobody wants a nuclear war to start. Like, that is, you know, like all nuclear powers are super engaged at this point. And so I would just say that that's a frustrating part of the movie, that and they, you know, they did it through this one person and not very many contacts, but in reality the DoD has contacts, State Department has contacts, the White House has contacts, and everybody else. And so this idea of we can't attribute it and we're not really working very hard at that right now was one of the parts of the movie that I found, you know, like very difficult to believe.
No. Oh no, I kept wondering, why are they using the NERC, which is the National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center that has a three secure lines between us and the Russians. But again, you know, understand that it's a movie. And you know, and it did highlight the importance of crisis communication. Which even when we disagree with our adversaries, you know, having the ability to talk is key. So one of the questions we got, taking it back to missile defense, is how is Israel's Iron Dome seemingly effective, as opposed to sort of the ineffective system that we saw here? Bob, why don't you take that one?
Okay, that's really an easy one. The Iron Dome system in Israel is intended for a completely different class of targets. So we're talking about theater ballistic missiles that don't go, comparatively speaking, don't go very high and don't go very fast. And so the Iron Dome system is very effective at what it does. When we're talking about ICBMs, it's a completely different topic. We're talking about much, much faster, much, much higher. We talked earlier about, you know, hitting a bullet with a bullet. It's just a different category. So you couldn't even begin to use the Iron Dome technology to do what the Golden Dome technology is intended to do. It's a completely different technology.
Also, gold is a malleable metal. I don't know why you would want that. Iron is much harder. But that aside, Alex, we had a question about, was it accurate that the president was still at an event as this crisis was starting to unfold? They did pull him out, but is it realistic that they would have waited that long to pull him into the conversation?
I don't know. That's a really interesting question. I saw that whole thing as being a reference to George W. Bush on 9/11, right? That was the classic, the photograph of him reading My Pet Goat or whatever in this classroom and then getting this information. I do think it's correct in emphasizing that these, you know, kinds of things are not necessarily going to happen on a timescale that's convenient to the president or anybody else. I remember doing the 2018 North Korea, excuse me, it wasn't North Korea, but the early warning accident in Hawaii, the false alarm. And I talked to some people who are in, you know, the nuke kind of community, and they would say things like, well, I knew that, you know, the situation wouldn't happen. And my quiz is always like, do you know what time it is in Pyongyang? Because you probably don't, right? Most people don't keep that knowledge on the top of their head. And is it the middle of the night? Is it the middle of the day? What are they doing over there? I don't know. It's on the other side of the world. There are people whose job it is, obviously, to know that. But if you're not working in some sort of intelligence operation, you're not going to know in advance. In this case, with the film, I do think there's this. The one thing I think they do a good job of. I do think, as in the film, there would be a lot of initial reluctance to accept that the thing was happening. I think that time would be lost because people don't want to overreact and they don't want to create a problem where there isn't one. There's a lot of examples of this sort of thing historically where we have these defense mechanisms where we essentially want to deny that this horrible thing could be happening. And so if this very improbable looking thing uh, did occur, I do think there would be a hesitation to do something like what they do in the movie, where they yank the president out in this very visible way, which by itself is going to create potentially problems, unless they were absolutely sure that this was the kind of thing that was worth that risk.
Hmm. All right, we're running out of time, but I want to get each of you sort of an assessment of, having watched this film, what do you think the main messages the public should take away from this film, and if there was another nuclear movie that you would recommend that they watch? It could be your favorite. It could just be one that you think people should go watch. What would that be? So first, your thoughts of what you hope people will take away from this, and then a recommendation if people want to go further down the nuclear movie rabbit hole. So Bob, let's start with you.
Uh, I think probably the conclusion that has already been discussed, and that is that missile defenses are not a panacea, and perhaps are even worse than that. They create more problems than they solve. I would like for the public to take away probably the message that wasn't sent, and that is that the military and the rest of the national security apparatus operates in a very very clear, well understood way, and it's not as chaotic as perhaps it's been shown.
And a recommendation for another nuclear movie?
I'd have to think about that one. Again, I thought that the timing constraint against the president was just incorrect, and perhaps another movie might get that more correct.
Hmm. Is there, okay, we'll come back to you in case you think of one that you would recommend folks to watch. But Jill, your takeaway thoughts and film rec.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that the movie did was remind people that nuclear weapons still exist, and that we should think, like we shouldn't just dismiss that as a civil society should have this discussion and think about it. And I think that that's good. And I appreciate the fact that there may be viewers of this movie who, can think about this in a way they haven't thought about before. Um, and, I think the fact is that nuclear weapons are still a deterrent. And we've seen this, in Russia's saber rattling in Ukraine. Clearly, they've used the fact that they have nuclear weapons as part of their overarching execution of that war. The other thing I like about the movie is that it takes us away from mutually assured destruction, which was sort of a Cold War theory, to more of a limited nuclear exchange, which we think about much more today than we used to. And so while there's lots of contrivances to get us there, the fact is limited nuclear exchange is really is in the debate and the people who follow nuclear issues. So look, I don't think a better nuclear movie could be made than Doctor Strangelove, honestly. But if you want to sort of do like today's environment, and I'm not a filmmaker, so I have no idea how you could do this in like 2 hours, but I would try to like explore the multinational nature of nuclear now more than just it's a US-Russia thing, which and do pull the thread on this limited nuclear exchange, but more realistic about how we would think about responses and how we would talk to one another during that. So I think there would be, there could be a rich part of a movie with how do we really talk to one another? How much do we really trust one another? And what if it's like we're talking to both Russia and China at the same time? I think that could be interesting. And then I think the idea, and it was introduced in this movie, well, let's wait and see what happens. Not all of these things work. I'm not so sure about not all of them work, but they work in different ways, or they could, like what, and so explore that a little bit more. So I think if there's a lot of room here for follow-up or for somebody else to do another type of movie.
Excellent. All right, Alex.
So I think the things that people take away that I think is ought to take away that I think are really positive from the movie. One is this like concrete reality of this nuclear world, that it's this dispersed facilities and people, and that I think a lot of people think of nuclear weapons in a very abstract way, that this is just like the bomb and it's out there somehow. But just imagining that these systems exist and they're all over the place and they involve different types of people. And for this kind of technology to be used requires this massive synchronization. Sometimes things won't work the way you expect them to in the moment. Even something as dumb and simple as like the calls not merging correctly because they're on different lines. This is not outside the realm of possibility. Anybody who's tried to do any sufficiently complicated technological thing, even with Zoom, will know that, the minute you sit down, your microphone doesn't work on the final day, the day of the thing, and you have to get another adapter or something like this. These things don't wait for the opportunities that, they don't wait for the perfect moment for us. And lastly, I think that it's really ultimately the decisions come down to human beings, people who are not really in a position where they're that prepared necessarily to make these decisions, even if they have trained, even if they've abstractly thought about it. If you're not in the position where millions of lives are on the line, which fortunately we are generally not, it's very hard to know how you'll respond to that. And that may be idiosyncratic, it may be deeply personal, it may be very clinical. I think that people are going to, with in a real crisis, they have limited options and limited information. I think the movie does a really good job of sort of highlighting that aspect. And since Jill already said Dr. Strangelove, I'm going to just recommend a book instead. Jeffrey Lewis's 2020 report, which is a little out of date now because it was written in 2018, is, I think, a really short um, exercise that would also make a great movie in thinking about what are the conditions that might lead to a nuclear weapon being used in the present moment. And it's about a confrontation between the United States and North Korea. And Jeffrey is, an analyst, a wonk, a person who's quite interested in the details and historical analogies. And so the book is footnoted extensively, even though it's fiction, saying, this sounds outlandish, but it actually happened in 2012 or something like this. And I think that is a really nice way. What I like about his book, in a way that addresses some of the issues I have with the film, it spends a lot of time of building up what is the context in which this thing might happen. What is a plausible context, and doesn't rely on, well, somebody decided to do it and we don't know who, which necessarily throws you into an unrealistic and contrived situation. Whereas actual plausible pathways, that's actually a lot scarier, especially when they're based on historical events that took place. So that'll be my fictional recommendation. Not a movie, but it should be.
Thanks for that, Alex. Bob, do you have a quick one? We're almost out of time.
I do, yes. So all we've been talking about here is ICBMs. Probably the more likely war that gets started is a land war with tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons, which likely will quickly escalate. And so a movie about probably the more likely type of nuclear war could be very useful.
No, thanks for that. And I'm grateful that Hollywood has seen fit to reintroduce this subject to a broader public and is opening up debates. And you heard it here. If there are any filmmakers watching, you've got some great possible experts who can help you build the next nuclear movie. We have a lot more content on our website about this film and other nuclear films. As well as the latest on the nuclear threats that we're facing in the real world. So please take a look at the bulletin, subscribe, become a reader. We hope to see many of you next week at our annual dinner, Conversations Before Midnight, in Chicago, Illinois. We'll be having conversations with Blaise Aguera, Vice President and Fellow at Google, and Jan Tallinn, the founding engineer of Skype and co-founder of the Cambridge Center for the Study of Existential Risk and the Future of Life Institute. So that'll be a great conversation. We'll be posting parts of it. If you can't make it to Chicago, definitely stay tuned for our next event, which will be coming up in December. And thank you all for tuning in.
Recording stopped.
Great. John Maka, ready to go ahead?
Yep, just clicking buttons. Yep, we're letting everybody in from the Zoom chat now.
Perfect.